Yes, people, Black Eyes TV, back again. Gentrification and education, UK to USA link up show. We're in the house again, bringing you the information. Terry, co host extraordinaire, talk to the people then.
Loving it, loving it, loving it. Loving it like this. People, I hope you're going to enjoy a beautiful day today of loads and loads of information like how you got yesterday. And you know what? When you have the opportunity, you can go to the Moorish Bazaar this weekend, or you can go to the African market tomorrow, or you can do a march. But I know what you got to do is stay black, be black, spend black, make it a black weekend. Now we've got a special guest today by the name of Richard D. Benson II. Straight from the USA link up. Now, Rich, let's begin this deep conversation, this deep information with our brother Richard. Richard number 2.
That's it. We got to be clear tonight.
I know, right? Hey, people, how you doing? How you doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Introduce yourself, Richard. Tell them what you're about, what you do, and how you're gonna jump on the plane to come and visit the people in the UK.
Indeed. My name is Richard Benson, Richard E. Benson II. I'm an assistant professor in the education department at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. This is my 9th year on faculty at that institution. And since being there, I have been fortunate and blessed enough to be able to finish a manuscript that has been out with Peter Lang, which actually has international offices, but is mainly based in the UK. The name of that book is called Fighting for Our Place in the Sun, Malcolm X and the Radicalization of the Black Student Movement. Much of my work, it looks squarely at critical educational history or Black struggle history, dealing with Black life throughout the diaspora. So we're talking about a very African diasporic, critical historical worldview that investigates politics of place, cultural history, social movements, in addition to criticisms and I would say very systemic and dialectical criticisms with respect to capital and political economy, and definitely anti-imperialist and anti-colonial work. So I've been engaged in this type of in this undertaking for quite some time, and one of the best courses that I've been fortunate enough to teach since I've been at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, is called Advocacy at Urban Schools. This particular course, it looks at the underpinnings of education to see how the social, historical, economic, cultural forces align with and support and intersect the I would say the nexus of education, to see how all things come to fruition as it relates to education. And it's a great course that I really enjoy teaching, and I really enjoy providing my students with information and some intellectual rigor so they can have a lens and a set of resources to be able to navigate and identify Black life in Atlanta and Black life from wherever that they come from, because we get students from outside of the U.S. To include students who are obviously from the U.S., from cities such as Chicago, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, New York, Philadelphia, Oakland, California, Houston, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia, Washington, D.C. So we get students from all over. And one thing I can tell you, gentlemen, and for the audience who has so graciously tuned in, much of what it is that they tell me, it mirrors. With respect to the anecdotes, you would actually think that they were talking about the same particular city, even though they're talking about a variation of spaces depending upon which state that they come from. I know tonight's conversation is really looking at neoliberalism, is looking at gentrification, and I don't normally do what it is I'm about to do in this particular way, but I want to be very proactive and vigilant about tonight's discussion in terms of what it is that I'm going to present. And I'm going to start off strictly with the story. So my work, as I said before, it looks at the Black freedom struggle, and it's not work that's specific to the U.S. I've been fortunate enough to be able to travel and go over to the UK a few times and fell in love with New Beacon Books up in what's the park up there, Terry? The section where New Beacon Books is, where the Padmore Institute is. Oh God. Finsbury Park. So up in Finsbury Park. Right. So fell in love with New Beacon. Looking forward to seeing many other bookstores or whatever, but at the top of New Beacon, as many of you know, you have the Padmore Institute, and that particular repository has been able to provide a wealth of information in addition to going to the Black Cultural Archives and Center down in Brixton, a wealth of information in that particular repository with certain archives. So my travels have allowed me to not only, I would say, build upon old visions, redirect and shift new ideology and perspectives, and begin to develop new ideas as it relates to my travels. So one of the major projects that I have coming up is a project called Resistance Under the Crown. And it's looking at Black education protests and alternative school movements that took place in conjunction with bookshops in the UK. But before that project, I'm finishing up a book right now that's called Funding the Revolution, Black Power, White Church Money, and the Financial Architects of Black Radicalism in the U.S. from 1966 to 1976. So because of a grant that I was fortunate enough to get back in 2013, I was able to spend a summer in Brooklyn, New York, stayed in Bedford-Stuyvesant. So a good friend of mine, we shared an apartment. He worked on his book, which is actually currently out now. Good friend of mine by the name of Dr. David Stovall, who's at the University of Illinois Chicago, and I was there working on my project, doing data collection at the Schomburg up in Harlem. So we were staying in Brooklyn, and we just got up every morning and worked on our projects, and just really tried to take in a Brooklyn life. And I will never forget one morning I got up and I went to the Brooklyn Y. No, not the Brooklyn Y, but a Y in Brooklyn. So a YMCA in Brooklyn in Bedford-Stuyvesant. So I would get up in the morning, I would walk down to the YMCA, and so I could go get a workout in. So I walked down this particular morning and got on the treadmill. So I'm working out, getting a pretty good workout in. And black man walked by me, young cat, mid-40s. He walked by me with a T-shirt on, and the T-shirt said, "Gentrification sucks." Now, I'm a T-shirt guy, especially in the summertime or whatever. I like, to have very unique type of T-shirts on, sometimes provocative or whatever, but something that you look at and say, that's extremely unique. I wonder where you got it from. And this was one of those types of shirts. So I'm on the treadmill. I'm almost falling off the treadmill trying to get his attention to find out where he got the shirt from. So I hop off the treadmill, talk to the cat, and I said, "Excuse me, brother." I said, "Man, that's one hell of a shirt that you got on." And they're saying a whole lot, literal and figurative. I'm like, "Where'd you get the shirt?" He said, "Oh, I make them." I said, "Oh, really?" He was like, "Yeah." He said, "You want to buy one?" I said, "Definitely." I said, "Let me get two." So he said, "Well, cool. When you get done with the workout or whatever, just meet me outside in about 45 minutes to an hour. And, I'll have a couple of shirts for you. They're, $20 a piece." He said, "No problem." So got done with the workout, stepped outside, met the cat. We started talking or whatever, sold me the shirts. And I said, "What motivated you to make this shirt?" He said, "Look, I'm a victim of gentrification right now. And I'm a victim in such a way that I never really thought it would take place in Brooklyn or to me in such a way that it impacted me to the degree I really can't recover from it financially." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, look, I was standing in this building on Bedford Avenue in Brooklyn, in Bed-Stuy, probably about 3 blocks from the YMCA. I said, "Okay." He said, "Man, I had been in that building almost 10 years. I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "My rent was it didn't inflate past $1,200, and I had been there 10 years, and I figure over that time I probably had maybe about 4 rent increases. But you figure cost of living increase, rent increase, etc. People increase with salaries. You expect for your rent to go up. No problem. He said, but the last, he said, but second to the last year before he was forced to leave due to the increase, he said the landlord rented out an apartment rented out a space to a young white guy who had recently came out of grad school. I said, okay. He said, but the white guy was paying approximately $1,700 for his apartment. But everybody else in the building, who was mainly black, was paying approximately between $1,000 and about $1,200. So you figure the average of everybody else was paying about $1,100. So they found out that the young white guy was paying what it was he was paying, and they said, well, look, why don't we go to the landlord and try to get your rent decreased so that it's more equitable, or it's more comparable to what it is that we're paying, so that you don't have to pay that much. He said, but the white guy did not want to go to the landlord. He wanted to keep his rent where it was. He couldn't figure it out at first, but then he thought about it. He said, oh, you're going to be the new price point as it relates to where the rent is going to be set, because the projection for the demographic within this particular condo or this apartment building or whatever is not going to be at the $1,100, $1,200 mark. It's going to be at the $1,700 mark and more. So he said a year and a half later, the landlord increased the rent for everybody in that building at the $1,700 mark, and then it continued to increase where everybody was priced out. So the projections, as I was saying, are stating based off of the story that I'm giving you, whatever. So we're talking about something that's systemic. And that microcosm of an example is nothing more than a greater reflection as it relates to how sociologists, urban planners, etc., those who write from a critical perspective as it relates to the depopulation, in addition to the dispossession and marginalization of many of these communities indigenous to spaces, be it in the US, be it in France, be it in the UK. But it's in general terms, now we're talking about a major concept that identifies the right to the city. And it's twofold, because for the persons who have been there for generations, you already have an established right based on you having had generations come through a particular block, whether it was your great-grandmother, your grandmother, your mom, etc. When people go to school, they come back or move back home. And within these spaces, you have persons who essentially have been able to establish their right to a community, but most importantly, their right to a physical space. So they've been able to establish politics in place within this particular locale for the extent that they've existed as a family and a family unit to include extended family. So you take that example and you stretch it out, and you multiply it times, tens of thousands of black families throughout Chicago, Detroit, New York, etc. And what many people are finding is that many of these urban spaces, the initial populations prior to you having migratory patterns of black and brown folk moving to major cities was essentially, it was a white locale where you had, sons and daughters of European immigrants who have moved to city spaces throughout the United States in order to secure a foothold in the job force or the labor force. Now, as you had the migrations take place from southern cities in the US to northern cities, then you had not only an entire new class of potential, I would say, potential bodies, black bodies for the workforce, but this new proletariat class that is now going to enter into the superstructure will actually be willing to work a whole lot longer and get paid less based on the conditions and the economic and political situations for which they were fleeing from in the South. So white terror, the failures of black reconstruction, the failures of any local law agency or enforcement apparatus to be able to support Black folks who coming out of the South in order to be able to say that we will protect your rights as citizens. We don't even see you as citizens for the most part. So when you have a mass exodus and these people are going to northern cities, well, one of the first things that would take place is that you have an overpreponderance of new bodies within space, but now you're dealing with northern white violence. So you're not in Alabama, you're not in Georgia, you're not in Mississippi, you're not in South Carolina, you're not in Florida, you're not in Texas, you're not in these spaces, you're now in Illinois, you're now in Michigan, you're now in New York State, you're now in Pennsylvania. You're in these northern spaces, but the violence as it relates to what it is that you're dealing with in this new white population is just as aggressive and vehement as it was in the South. The only difference is that you're in a cosmopolitan, major metropolitan area in the northern states. So what happens? White flight. White families begin to flee. But prior to fleeing, you have to deal with restrictive covenants. In addition to restrictive covenants, you have covenants that restrict your movement based on law enforcement under the guise of what we has been identified as hypermilitarization that you see manifested within a form of folks who are running around using the mantra law and order. That means we're going to beat your behind if you walk north of this street, south of this street, west of this street, because these are the sections that you don't socialize in versus the sections that we will keep you in. But when that becomes too much in order to be able to contain Black life, white folks just say, we're leaving these spaces. And as they leave, they go to the suburban spaces, or we say the suburbs. Now, within these central cities, over generations of time, from the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, the jobs did stay for quite some time. But as you had a shift in the demographic populace and the racial representations began to display an overpreponderance of Black bodies, then now Black life within the city and life in the city, for the most part, is driven by the presence of all things African, be it from the stateside, be it coming from the West Indies, be it coming from Europe, be it coming, from the Caribbean, the Polynesian, Melanesian islands. Like, it's really driven by Black life and all things that are cultural and germane to Black life. But what does leave? Well, the underpinnings of the city that really fuel the engine of the political apparatus, which essentially is banking / commerce, investments, real estate, and most importantly, schools. So all of this is central to a particular city. So even though the financial support, or I would say the representation that's attached to value, which in this particular essence is whiteness, has moved to the suburbs within the city or urban space or the inner city, you still have Black life. But you know what? These cities have always been valuable. Them white folks didn't want to leave. The white presence never really wanted to leave. They just didn't want to live around Black life. They didn't want to live around Black bodies. So the reversal in 2017, which for the most part has been going on, or the beginnings of it for the most part had been begun in definitely within the mid to late 90s, is what we see is, folks are saying gentrification, but most importantly, it's gentrification, but made even more simple. It's a neoliberal moment in which you have the reduction of government and you have the public in bed or married to private, in which public funds, in many cases, whether we're talking about charter schools, or we're talking about corporate welfare and taxes, has enabled them to maneuver with the very laissez-faire engagement of not only, I would say, the entrepreneurial opportunity in space, but then definitely when it comes to education, definitely all things dealing with school. So if you can recapture the center, or you can recapture the city, you will also recapture a certain populace that at one point had fled, but is now experiencing a renaissance to essentially reverse the flight and go back into these urban or these inner city spaces. Now, gentrification, as we see it, or as I've seen it in Chicago, as a story that I've just given you about the gentleman that I met in New York and Brooklyn 4 years ago, or for however that is taking place in Philadelphia and Detroit, etc., essentially is you driving down the value of a community, be it due to violence, be it due to some aspect of the terror dealing with law enforcement, being it due to a cocaine or illegal substance or uncontrollable substance usage, some form of an opiate, and the land and space is made desolate. In the 80s and the 70s, they would always talk about urban renewal, which was code for many persons to mean Negro and Black and Brown removal. So currently you look up and you see, well, we're not literally forcing anybody out through eminent domain. We're not saying that we're going to build an expressway through this particular community this time, as we've done in days past, be it in Liberty City, or I would say in Overtown in Miami, or the Crosstown Expressway that took place in the Bronx. Not this time, but we're going to inflate all things as it relates to life within a city. We're going to inflate parking. You can't loiter here. So it's going to cost you just to have some aspect or a modicum of recreation within this city. So that includes your parking. That includes your ability to be able to purchase, buy, sell. That includes your ability to be able to socialize with friends, in addition to your regular bills. So that means inflation of real estate, in addition to an increased presence of police. And definitely we're talking about social amenities as well. So you're going to, for the most part, gravitate toward the amenities, toward the particular types of events, whether it's a concert, whether it's you go into the park for the most part. But the main thing that really dictates your ability to be able to engage in amenities, social and otherwise, is your affordability. Can you essentially pay for what it is that's being offered in this space, to include your overhead of lodging or where you live, the amenities that go along with it, for lights, for gas, etc., your groceries, etc. Can you afford what's attached to this in addition to where you live and having to go to work, etc.? But if you can't, then you, as a critical mass of your entire populace, racially, is definitely going to be pushed out due to affordability. And the thing is that for the generations that persons had been gone from the space, that didn't mean that they didn't like the skyline of that city, or being close near the lake of that particular city, or close to a museum district of that city, or being close to the parks and recreation and the amenities of that municipality that they were able to provide for the persons who are the residents of that city. It didn't mean that they didn't like it. It just means that they didn't want to be around your black behind while they was doing it. So now that you can't afford it and you're being pushed out due to a number of factors: affordability, prison industrial complex, military industrial complex, definitely in addition to all things dealing with, I would say, how space is being re-engineered for the purposes of ensuring that whatever neighborhood school and school that you would have been attached to is either non-existent, or you're not qualified to be able to go there because by their particular standards, you don't test well enough, or they're only going to take a certain percentage of folks into this school that's now identified as a selective enrollment choice type of school, which in many cases now contemporarily is turning into charter. Because these things are taking place as it relates to education, it's now another vehicle, the apparatus that's in place to ensure that the general project, as one of my friends will always say, the general colonial project of 2017 and the 21st century is now in full swing, in order to ensure that you do have a new populace. And urbane won't be synonymous with black and brown. Urbane will be synonymous with exclusive, Eurocentric, white, and all those individuals, for the most part, who have a residual income, which in many cases has been accumulated through wealth over generations, because they've been the benefactors and the beneficiaries of essentially those persons who've never had to suffer it or be subjected to any type of discrimination, and thus financially they aren't in any way, shape, or form handicapped by those particular impediments. So I've given a lot, and I haven't necessarily gone through the PowerPoint. That's for the folks who, for the most part, just will be able to tap into it. But some key things that I really want to cover, just in terms of looking at the PowerPoint, for example, is, okay, well, what is neoliberalism? Now, this definition comes from the work of Pauline Littman, who's an educational policy theoretician. She wrote this book called, The New Political Economy of Education. It comes from that particular book. And the diagram that I really want to put up so everybody can have a chance to see it is this global trend of cities. So as you see it, essentially we have a circle inside of a circle. And depending upon how much that we actually want to deconstruct this particular model, you could actually put several smaller circles inside of this particular circle. And then you can have other circles outside of the center. But the center is essentially this space where we have essentially what Edward Shields will refer to as a space of the sacred. So you have the engineering of ideas, you have the production of capital, you have the custodianship that's granted to the political sector for persons who are receiving an elite education, in addition to law enforcement and the policy arena and all things that are generated from the center as it relates to finances. All of these things are essentially born out of this space. And also within this space are the values. Now, whose values? Great question. Values of the persons who identify, the sacred as it relates to you being a patriot. Values of the individuals who actually identify the center of the space in which we will identify what particular commodities in exchange or modes of exchange will be relevant, in terms of how it is that we will dictate society. Religious values as it relates to color or hue, values as it relates to all things around education, not training, but education for an elite sector of individuals, because we will draw a very, very deep line of demarcation between those who are the owners, the operators, and the individuals who essentially are subjected to and work for. We will draw these lines, and they will be so ensconced that from the center, all things as we define it will essentially be actualized or made manifest. So the center is a critical space. And ideologically, as I've just been speaking for the most part, it can exist as a space, as the center, be it an institution. But in this particular diagram, we're talking about a physical space. But as a space itself being a physical space, now you can actually, I would say, almost create a particular interface is what it is that I've been speaking of, ideological as a particular concept that's driven, from those who are, the generation, not the generation, the generators of a particular value. Now think of it physically. Now, as the physical space that now is, I would say, the bedrock of all things ideological, as I aforementioned, it now is twofold. It's physical and it's ideological. So you think of going to Chicago, you'd be able to see the museums, benefit from going to the lake, benefit from going to Navy Pier, the museum district, from the new Barack Obama library that's coming, from all things that for the most part make a cosmopolitan and very sophisticated metropolitan urbane area that make it a city and a tourist attraction, and as many folks would like to just refer to it, as sexy as possible for the gravitas and pull that it will have for persons to either become inhabitants or those who will just navigate space for a weekend or a couple of weeks or whatever, spend their money to essentially feed that particular machine. And as it's constructed, in that space, you get those persons who are the tastemakers. You get those individuals in those particular populations and social circles who ensure that all things as they establish it pervade from the center moving out to the periphery. So that particular diagram I really want the public to become familiar with. also have here a slide here that's looking at school closures. And as you close schools, well, you don't necessarily leave the space dormant. It will be re-engineered. But one major thing in all of these major cities, as you can see, where schools are closed as it relates to the sweeping wave and process of gentrification. Well, if schools close and new populaces and demographics actually replace old indigenous individuals, black and brown faces who have to move to other cities, to the outskirts of the city for the most part, well, the physical space is still going to be there. But now this particular space is now going to be inhabited by those who will re-engineer a school, who will re-engineer a community in order for it to serve its needs. So in this sense, now you have schools that are being closed in predominantly black and brown neighborhoods for projections. And these projections for the urban planners, they'll tell you that though you see a particular demographic by race or ethnicity inhabiting this community in years to come, be it the years of 10, 15, 20, very much in a longitudinal phase, this community will shift and these schools will now serve a different populace. So this is a national trend. And most importantly, as you do have gentrifiers who essentially reinforce the current phases of a colonial project who move into certain neighborhoods, without question, one of the first queries that they have, especially for those who are young couples and family owners, they ask simply, well, what are the good schools? What are the good schools like around here, etc.? Oh, they're in this neighborhood, they're not in this neighborhood. However, they're not in this particular neighborhood, but the potential for a school to be in this neighborhood that will serve the educational and also social interests of this new family and families that are coming in can now be built as well, based on you having an open space, or I would say this clean slate available due to the fact that you close an overpreponderance of schools that once served the black and brown populace. I've been covering a lot. I feel like I'm talking too much. You brothers with me?
We're still here. We're still here.
Okay, cool. Cool.
Before we start tackling it.
The only thing I want to add here is to the people that are listening, and for reference, again, when the brother has finished going through this, what I will be doing and what we will be doing in conversation form is obviously giving the UK, USA breakdown, because everything the brother's saying, make no mistake, is happening here and across Europe. So we are going to go into that deeper and really get into depth, but I'm loving the presentation so far. All right, cool.
And I get excited about my work. I really do. So, you know, I get a little long-winded. So, you know, at some point, if you need to just, you know, chime in order so we can take the conversation in a different direction and, you know, have it more of a dialogue, you know,
don't worry.
Just give me a signal.
You're laying the roots right now for the conversation, because again,
okay, cool.
I think it's important for people to understand the terminologies. That's why I hadn't seen your slides beforehand.
Gotcha.
So just before I went to chime in, you started coming with the breakdowns of the heading, which I think is the best possible way to move forward.
Okay, cool.
Really get a visual picture of what we're saying.
Gotcha.
So go in, brother, where it all is.
All right, cool. So dig it. About a week ago, I was in Washington, D.C. I went to Howard University in order to do some data collection for the current project that I'm finishing up. I was looking at the papers of Amiri Baraka. So while I was there, I stayed at an Airbnb in D.C. So a couple rented out their garden. It's down from a high school called Dunbar, named after the great Renaissance man Paul Laurence Dunbar. But in this section of DC, I can tell you, as I'm speaking to the general audience, that this section, without question, just within a 10 or 15 year space, was a community that most folks didn't even walk in, let alone now find the price point of brownstones and condominiums anywhere between $750,000 and up, as relates to you either buying or just being able to rent property within a space. Rent without question for a 1 bedroom is upwards to almost $3,000. Now, in this neighborhood that I'm in, I found it more convenient for me to just be able to take an Uber or a cab because I had a great parking space. And in many cases, I'm sure just like in the UK and London, especially, parking can be tight. Brother Terry, he hit me to that the last time I was there in 2016, that, you know, with as many tickets as a person can get, you know, those who are issuing them will get them. Same thing in DC, especially New York, especially in Chicago. So while in DC, I would take taxis and Ubers. I had two particular drivers, both black men, who broke down a few things as it related to gentrification that was taking place in the city. DC, Washington, DC, had always been known in the conversations of black life on a national scale to have been a chocolate city. Then as gentrification began to happen, folks would say, well, you know what, now DC is more like a chocolate chip city. And now in 2017, as you have had, an enormous level of inflation as it relates to price points for, you know, the inhabitants and persons who are indigenous to DC, black folks, you know, they say it's not even chocolate chip no more. You may have a sprinkle, if that. And as they begin to talk about who's being pushed out, one thing that was extremely significant about both of the conversations, I had them in separate times, two different Uber or cab rides, but they both said the same thing. Wherever you see a mass push out or purging of black folks in space that have historically been either undesirable or deemed undesirable, or have been deemed as areas that were not restorable, you see the building of, the construction of, the refurbishment and rehabilitation of physical space. So they would say they're building this new stadium, you know, this new plaza, this new park, water park or something. They would always say this in conjunction with what it is that they were telling me that's taking place as it relates to this mass purging and push out of, you know, black and brown populations throughout DC. And, you know, I was just telling them, I said, it's no different in Chicago. Same thing is taking place in Atlanta, because what it is that I didn't really get into with my cab rides, but I was just really sitting thinking about what it is that they were telling me, because I said, well, you know what? Systemically, this is duplication in such a way within the U.S. And as I was stating earlier, I've seen it to some degree in London, but I'm not a Londoner or whatever. I don't spend that much time there, so I really can't speak to the totality of it there. I've heard about it going on in Paris, but to what it is that I've been able to see within the U.S., the level and degree of replication is so outstanding. It's almost mesmerizing, to the point where I would just think to myself, well, at what time, at what era, at what year was the decision made that the national move as it relates to reclamation of these city spaces would take place, and how would it take place? I wonder about that particular moment, because the parallels and the simultaneous levels of reclamation and being within these spaces for young white couples, young white males, young white females, it's almost indescribable. So case in point, so we're well aware of what the correction of the prison industrial complex looks like locally and to some degree internationally. The United States has been a purveyor, and I would say the premier carceral state, without question. And as a tool to dispossess, or as a tool to engineer the reclamation of space for, you know, the current colonial project phase of gentrification, one thing that's been made apparent within the U.S. is the usage of law, the usage of particular statutes as it relates to arrests. But in this particular instance, I'll give you another anecdote, because one of my drivers said, we grew up smoking weed, we grew up smoking marijuana. Some of us sold it, some of us sold things a little bit harder. But, you know, for the most part, it was nothing to the point where anybody on our block was moving kilograms of cocaine. He said, but many of my friends have been incarcerated for petty crimes. He said, but you know the outstanding and the most mesmerizing thing taking place contemporarily in DC? I said, what? He said, there are over 40 marijuana dispensaries in DC proper today. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, not only that, but not only is it legal to smoke what it is that you couldn't smoke or what you would get arrested for if you were black and especially male in DC 10 or 15 years ago, but now this city has been re-engineered in such a way that not only can't he afford to live there based on him not having, you know, a particular cachet of finances or haven't had the social capital built up, or I would say increased in such a way that his presence is seen valuable. So he can't live there for those particular factors, but he definitely can't live there just based off of the fact that the way things are re-engineered, that his presence is not a commodity versus the new white populace is filtering in is now being valued as property. What do I mean by that? So Cheryl Harris, critical race theoretician, she wrote an article, law review, whatever, around whiteness. And specific to her article, her argument essentially is that, in the title, that whiteness is property. So essentially, the way you place value on real estate, the way you place value on commercial real estate, a particular park, a landmass, etc., and as you identify and identify in addition to label that particular value for the property, so too is that level of value within whiteness as property. So the mere presence of whiteness, be it white family, young white couple, white boy, young white girl, older white teen, etc., there's value that's placed on that particular life due to, not due to, but as it relates to how it is that you want to be able to engage, for the purposes of law enforcement, education, politics, all things cultural in relation to you entering or having access to school, etc. So as the value is placed, that value can now make a new determination as to the bounds of legality, in addition to what will now be deemed as inappropriate, as you will now be a transgressor of whatever law that we see fit to ensure that you're never able to return back to the city or the center. So that's something that became evident as well in terms of looking at the new marijuana dispensaries that are springing up nationally, because the revenue is outstanding as it relates to this new inception of cannabis and those who are now able to, smoke it without, or I'll say smoke it, utilize it, eat it, whatever that they're doing, for so-called medicinal purposes. Like, these particular things are now deemed appropriate versus those persons and populations who were demonized, criminalized, and victimized under the guise of all things that were deemed legal, or the enforcement of law and order. So that takes me to the space of social agency and advocacy. I'm always teaching my kids to say, well, I'm not here to give you a framework or an outlook that is insurmountable. The odds are never engineered in such a way that you cannot either overcome or thwart or interrupt them. So one of my students this semester, she was keen on always asking, well, Doc, what can we do? Like, is there anything we can do? Like, seriously, like, I'm just saying, I got a brother who's here. I got a cousin who's here. Like, what's the solution? And I said, well, I don't have, any magic or any particular solution or whatever. But I said, but a lot of what it is that's taking place, you really don't have any control over, because the historical precedent ensured that you would not have any generational wealth to be able to refer or draw upon in order to be able to support you in days as such that are in the now that won't allow you to gain any type of economic foothold. So for the days that you couldn't get the job, or that you were the first fired and the last hired, or for the days that you were not able to live in a particular community, or the days that you were not able to go to work stress-free and not have to worry about the bills that needed to be paid because you were robbing Peter to pay Paul and folks would not give you credit at the bank. You had to live in project housing. You had to live in a particular neighborhood that was war-torn due to an economic deficiency or a boom of cocaine or an opiate. Like the days which you had when you had to endure those things, they ensure that you would have a shorter life expectancy. And now for the newer generations that are, college bound and college educated in that particular sense, who are now the new professionals, we don't necessarily come from trust funds, as would someone whose ancestors or whose particular lineage or foreparents or grandparents would have been able to build up a cache of funds to ensure that their future generations will benefit from them. I said, but in the now, yeah, you probably can't buy real estate for $1 million or even $500,000, even probably not even for $250,000. I said, but guess what would happen if your generation was able to organize in such a way and did organize in such a way that collectively you were able to find 10 willing individuals to sacrifice for 10 years? And they would look at me like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, let's say you take a community that is undesirable at the moment, as I'm sure many other communities had been undesirable prior to, the new push to gentrify and reclaim by a new demographic. But let's just say that you find a community now that's undesirable in a city that you deem worthy of your inhabitants. Let's take Detroit. Now, Detroit is being bought up and overhand, over fist by Dan Gilbert, who is the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, in addition to other, interested entities, such as a family who owns Little Caesars Pizza, and other political and economic forces that, really want to ensure the resurgence of Detroit. But Detroit, for example, let's just say that it was Detroit. And you said, well, you know what, even though Detroit is being consumed in such a way that in 10 years it'll be, unrecognizable. So gone are the days of the auto industry, and now are the new days of, the hipsters and new entrepreneurial spirit of, young white people in their 20s who now are coming out of college who don't want to live in New York. I said, let's just say that Detroit is that space. And you really, really like Detroit, young black woman, young black man. You coming up out of college and you say, but you really want to live in Detroit because really it's still affordable. You can still get a house there. Now, socially, it's not as sophisticated with respect to the opulence that you may have in a New York or Chicago, but it's coming back. But let's just say you're patient enough with your 10 people. And what do you 10 people do? You 10 people, you go to a community or to a block. And you say, you know what? We're going to buy this block. The houses are less than $100,000. And I think if we pool our resources, the 10 of us will be able to secure maybe 3 houses, because there's an overpreponderance of abandonment. There's an overpreponderance of squatting in Detroit. There's an overpreponderance of foreclosure in Detroit. I mean, it's been depopulated by the hundreds of thousands of people just over the past 10 years. And it's to the point where I think Detroit is probably at 500,000 people. It will rise again. However, in the contemporary right now, if you had 10 black folks, men and women, who just said, well, you know what, we're going to go into Detroit, we're going to buy houses. And I'm going to assume that many of you people are going to actually have families as well. As you get older, as you buy property, whatever, you can now secure an entire city block. Now, however many houses on that block, let's say you have 8, 9, 10 or whatever, but the mere fact that you've been proactive to say that our vigilance is going to ensure that we are going to rebuild a community in such a way that it will work in our interest. Be able to say that we want this school to look this way because you're on the PTA. You've been on the PTA even before you had children. Now that you have children, you want to ensure that your children and the children of your friends and the relatives of those particular friends, et cetera, who are now finding it now attracted to move to this block in Detroit, as you did, are now beginning to create community and, most importantly, a constituency that must be regarded and interfaced with by whatever political force that exists within that city. So now, as you build community, 10 years have passed, 15 years have passed, 20 years have passed, you have a viable space. Oh, and guess what? Now, you know what? Those individuals who really want to be able to engage and benefit from your constituency find it necessary to build particular stores there. They find it necessary to build, the particular boutiques, the particular amenities that are necessary in order to ensure that you're made happy, because your dollar spent just like anybody else's dollar spent who are in that city as well. Maybe not in your community, but definitely in that city. Oh, and another thing, many of you, because you've done what it is that you set out to ensure will be the success of a future community, also are building a political constituency. You probably all vote the same way for the same things, which are essentially not party, not person, but interest. And because you do those things, well, now not only are you attracted to outside persons who want to ensure that they keep you happy because they want your dollars and your political thrust and support, but now whatever whatever political interests are in that city, they now have to meet with you, deal with you, and ensure your happiness by making sure that your community is thriving and always developing and moving forward in such a way that it speaks to the future even after you're gone. So that's what I told my students. And the social agents, as organizers, yeah, you work for community uplift. And it's not about the